Welcome to this lesson on absolute value and opposites. Please be sure you have these notes in front of you so that we can begin our lesson. For this lesson, we have two sets of I can statements. The first I can statement says, I can explain the meaning of opposites. And our second I can statement says, I can explain the concept of absolute value. So let's go ahead and talk about vocabulary on the left-hand side of our notes. Our first vocabulary word is called positive. Positive means data or numbers that are greater than 0. So an example of this would be positive 5, because that's greater than 0. Positive 100, that's greater than 0. 1, which is greater than 0. So these are three examples of positive numbers. Our second vocabulary word is called negative. Negative data is data less than 0. So for example, this could include a negative 5, negative 100, and negative 1. Those are three examples of negative numbers or negative data. Our next vocabulary word is called opposites. Opposites are numbers that are the same distance from 0 but in opposite directions. So for example, if I have this integer, which is positive 5, I could say that the opposite of positive 5 would be negative 5. Our next vocabulary word is called absolute value. Absolute value is the distance between a number and 0. Our final vocabulary word for today is called magnitude, which means the distance a number is away from 0. Sometimes you can refer to this as how large something is. If you ever hear of earthquakes, earthquakes are measured by magnitude, so how large an earthquake is. So the larger the earthquake, the larger the number is. The smaller the earthquake, the smaller the number is. So if I have a number of 5, 5 has a magnitude of 5 because it's 5 spaces away from 0. If I had the number 10, the magnitude of 10 would be 10 because it's 10 spaces away from 0. If I had the integer negative 2, the magnitude of negative 2 would be positive 2 because it is 2 spaces away from 0. So before we move on to the key concepts, I want to go back to absolute value, because one of the important things about absolute value is it's going to be shown to you as a symbol. And a lot of times they're going to be shown to you as two brackets, and there's usually going to be a number inside that bracket. And the way that you read that is the two brackets mean absolute value. So you would take the absolute value of the number inside of these two brackets. Alright, so on the right hand side, let's talk about some of the key concepts. Our first key concept is the word opposites. And whenever I see the word opposite, what I want you to do is I want you to think of the negative sign. So I'm going to draw a negative sign right above the word opposite. And just think of the word opposite as that negative sign. So if I'm given the integer of positive 2, and I want to find the opposite of positive 2, I'm going to just put a negative sign right in front of my integer. So I can say that the opposite of positive 2 is negative 2. Using a diagram here, I'm going to go ahead and place positive 2 on my little number line. And if I wanted to visually see what the opposite of positive 2 looks like, I'm going to take a pencil and jump onto the other side of 0 and land straight onto negative 2. So once again, the opposite of 2 is negative 2. Our second key concept says opposites of opposites. So once again, whenever I see that word opposite, I'm going to think of a negative sign. So I'm going to place a negative sign above that. And I see the word opposite again, so I'm going to place another negative sign there. So what I'm going to do is, say I'm given the number 1. And I want to find the opposite of positive 1. what I can think of is I can think of a negative and another negative written like this. So this first negative right here means opposite. The second negative here means opposite again. So the reason why I have two of them is because I'm talking about the opposite of opposite. Now if I wanted to show that on a number line, I can put my number, my dot on positive 1, and I'm going to take the opposite of positive 1, which is negative 1. But then I want to take the opposite again and start from negative 1 and go back to positive 1. So the opposite of opposite of 1 is 1. Finally, absolute value. The next key concept says the distance away that your number is from 0. That's what absolute value means. So if I look at my little number line down here, I'm going to write it as the absolute value of 4. And remember, this is the way you write it with the two brackets. And I'm going to count from 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. So the absolute value of 4 is equal to 4 because I moved 4 spaces away from 0. Now on the right hand side, I'm going to write the absolute value of negative 4. So there's those brackets again. And I'm going to start from 0 and count 1, 2, 3, 4. So the absolute value of negative 4 is equal to 4. So even if I'm moving in the opposite direction, it's still 4 spaces away from 0. There's no such thing as a negative distance. That's why the absolute value of negative 4 is equal to positive 4. So our first example says, find the opposite of negative 5. If I think back to my key concepts, it told me to write down a negative sign wherever I saw the word opposite. And I can write it like this: the opposite of negative 5. Anytime that you see two negatives sitting next to each other, you can cross them out because they cancel each other out, and you're left with whatever's left over. So 5 would be the answer. So the opposite of negative 5 is equal to positive 5. So let's look at the same situation using a number line. I'm going to start with 0 in the middle, and I'm going to count to the left negative 5 spaces. So there's negative 1, negative 2, negative 3, negative 4, negative 5. There's negative 5. I'm going to count to the right of 0, positive 1, positive 2, positive 3, positive 4, positive 5, and label that positive 5. So if I want to find the opposite of negative 5 using this number line, I'm going to put my first point, or my dot, at negative 5. And then I'm going to jump over 0 to find the opposite of negative 5, and it will land straight at positive 5. So I can say that the opposite of negative 5 is equal to positive 5, and that's what I found out earlier. So the opposites are the same distance away from 0. Negative 5 is the same distance away from 0 as positive 5. Example 2 says, find the opposite of 4. So let's go ahead and put a negative sign under the first opposite and put another negative sign under the second opposite. And let's write it like this: the opposite of 4. Once again, I see two negatives next to each other, so they're going to cross out, or cross each other out, cross cancel it. And I'm left with 4. So the opposite of 4 is equal to 4. Let's use that same scenario on our number line. I'm going to go straight to positive 4 on my number line down here, and I'm going to go ahead and jump over 0 to get to my opposite. But I need to go back because I have a second opposite. So from negative 4, I'm going to go ahead and jump back to positive 4 and end up at positive 4. So the opposite of 4 is equal to 4. And that's what we found out earlier. So pause the video, complete these got it problems, and then play it back for some feedback. Now that you had some time to work on it, let's take a look at the answer for letter A. The problem says, what is the opposite of 3? So the opposite of 3 should have been negative 3. Let's take a look at problem B. What is the opposite of negative 2? So the opposite of negative 2 should have been negative 2. So example 3, our I can statement changes. If you read it down here, it says I can explain the concept of absolute value. And it says to evaluate the absolute value of negative 7. Now remember, absolute value is the distance away a number is from 0, and it's shown using these little brackets. So if I want to solve this problem, what I want to do is I want to use a number line, and let's label 0 in the middle. And if I want to graph negative 7, I'm going to move to the left of 0 because it's negative. So here's negative 1, negative 2, negative 3, negative 4, negative 5, negative 6. Here's negative 7. And let's go ahead and graph negative 7 right here. Now if I want to figure out what the absolute value of that is, let's pretend like this is a person right here. And he's standing at 0. And an earthquake happens, and he moves 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. The absolute value of negative 7 is equal to 7 because he moved a magnitude of 7 spaces. So even if it's in the negative direction, he still moved 7 spaces. And that's the magnitude of absolute value. So he moved 7 spaces because of that earthquake. The magnitude was considered a 7. So the absolute value of negative 7 is equal to 7. So example 20 says to evaluate and find the absolute value of positive 20. So let's go ahead and graph. This is going to be 0, and I'm going to place 20 on the right hand side of 0 because it's a positive number. And I'm going to place the little man at 0. And now what happens is that there's going to be a little earthquake, and he's going to start to move. So here's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20. So he moved a magnitude of 20 spaces. So the absolute value of 20 is equal to 20. So example 5 says to evaluate. This one looks similar to problem number 3. However, they have an opposite or a negative symbol on the outside of our absolute value symbol. So before we move on to this problem, let's ignore the outside first, but come back to it later. Because they want me to find the opposite of whatever is inside of my absolute value symbol. So think about that. The opposite of whatever's inside. So I'm going to go ahead and graph it. Here's 0. And negative 7 is on the left-hand side of 0 because it's negative. So here's negative 1, negative 2, negative 3, negative 4, negative 5, negative 6, negative 7. And I'm going to go ahead and graph it right there. I know that the absolute value of negative 7 is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. It's 7 because it's equal to 7 spaces away from 0. But we need to go back to the problem and remember the little negative sign that we ignored at the beginning. So they want to know what the opposite of 7 is. And the opposite of 7 is negative 7. So if the negative sign is on the outside of the absolute value, we need to make sure we place it back into our final answer like we did here. So the answer is negative 7. So pause the video, complete the guided problems, and then play it back for some feedback. Now that you had some time to solve these problems, let's take a look at the answers for letter C. It's asking for the absolute value of 14. So if I have 0 at my number line, and 14 is on the right hand side of 0, the absolute value of 14 is equal to 14 because it is 14 spaces away from 0. So the absolute value of 14 is equal to positive 14. Let's take a look at letter D. We're going to ignore our opposite symbol on the outside for now, and let's just go ahead and find the absolute value of negative 9. Negative 9 is on the left hand side of 0 because it's negative. And we know that the absolute value of negative 9 is equal to 9 because it is 9 spaces away from 0. But we want to know the opposite of that. So let's go ahead and get our negative sign. And the opposite of 9 is equal to negative 9. So now that we've had some time to work on absolute value problems and opposite problems. Let's look at example 6, and it says to order the numbers from least to greatest. Let's go ahead and change this last part of the problem. Let's cross it out. And instead of saying from least to greatest, let's say from greatest to least. Alright? So now what we want to do is we want to take a look at the tiles that they're giving us. And we want to look at those numbers and place them from greatest to least down here in order. Now before we do that, we should look at our tiles and understand the value that each tile has. So the first tile says -3, so that's a pretty small number because it's in the negative region. We've got -7, which is another smaller number because it's also in the negative region. Now if I look at this number right here, that's the absolute value of 3. If I think about the absolute value of 3, it has a magnitude of 3, or an absolute value of 3. So that's the value of that tile. Let's take a look at the absolute value of 0. The absolute value of 0 would have a magnitude of 0 because it's 0 spaces away from 0, or the absolute value of that would be 0. Let's take a look at the absolute value of -7. -7 is 7 spaces away from 0, so it has a magnitude of 7. So that is the value of that tile. The absolute value of +1 has a magnitude of 1 because it's 1 space away from 0. So the value of that tile is 1. And the tile up here, it doesn't have an absolute value symbol, so that value is just equal to -1. So our job now is to go ahead and look at these tiles and place them in the correct order down here. And I'm going to look for the greatest number. And if I look through these tiles, the greatest number I see would have to be 7. But the original tile said the absolute value of -7, so I'm going to write whatever the original tile said. So the absolute value of -7 would be the greatest value so far. I'm going to cross it out so I don't use it again. Let's take a look at the next largest number. If I look at it, here it is, +3. And I'm going to write whatever it says on the tile, the absolute value of -3. And let's cross it out so we don't use it again. Let's look for the next largest number. Here it is, the absolute value of +1. So I'm going to write that same tile in the next box and cross it out so we do not use it again. Our next largest tile would be the absolute value of 0. Let's go ahead and write that in our little spot. Cross it out so we don't use it again. And now we're starting to get into the negative numbers. So if you remember from a couple days ago, we talked about negative numbers. The smaller it is, the larger it is. And the farther away you are from 0, or the smaller you are, the smaller it becomes. So the next greatest number will have to be -1, because -1 is closest to 0. Let's cross it out so we don't use it again. The next answer would have to be -3, because -3 is the next closest number away from 0. And our last number would be -7. Let's cross it out and let's place it here. And that has to be -7 because that's the furthest away from 0. So there's our answer. So pause the video, complete the problem, and then play it back for some feedback. Now that you had some time to work on this problem, let's go ahead and look at how you ordered these numbers from greatest to least. The first tile that you should have placed here was the absolute value of 11. The next tile that should have been placed here was the absolute value of -10. The next tile that should have been placed here was the absolute value of -5. The next tile that should have been placed here was the absolute value of -4. And we should be crossing these out once we use them so that we don't use them again. And then now let's go ahead and move into the negative region. Remember, the smaller the negative, the bigger the number is. So our next tile is -2. Let's cross it out. Our next tile is -3. Cross it out. And our last tile is -6. So this is the answer that we should have came up with. So now you've completed this lesson. Go ahead and self-rate yourself and tell us how you feel. If you have some questions, please write them down and bring them to class. And please watch the video again if there's an area that you do not understand.